Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the King's Gambit, starting after e4, e5, pawn to f4, and then we're going to have pawn takes pawn, King's Gambit accepted, we're going to have knight to f3, the King's Knight's Gambit, and now we're going to be taking a look at the Cunningham defense with bishop e7, and the whole purpose of me making this video is just to cover this one specific line. I want to cover this variation where black actually follows through with his threat of bishop to h4, so after bishop to c4, we're going to see this bishop to h4 check. And I exclusively want to cover something I like to call the fun variation, which is, objectively the best move here for white is probably to play something like king f1. But it is actually possible here to play this move pawn to g3. And I call this the fun variation, because basically what white says is, okay, you played bishop h4 check, and you forced my king to move, but guess what? I don't have to move my king. Instead, I can sacrifice a whole bunch of pawns, and I can get myself castled. So this is basically the idea. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on that notification icon. So I call this the fun variation. Of course, that isn't the name of it. The actual name of it is the Burton Gambit, but for years I've been calling it the fun variation. Me and a lot of friends of mine have been calling it the fun variation, and I do think it is in fact fun to play. After f captures g3, the intention is for white to castle, and then after g captures h2, the intention is to play king h1. As you can see, I've highlighted a bunch of stuff going on here. Essentially, black still has all of his pawns. Black has 8 pawns still on the board, and white only has 5. So black is up an amazing 3 pawns in this position, but white clearly has compensation, because black has moved the same piece twice. He's played bishop e7 to h4, and he's moved the same pawn 1, 2, 3, 4 times. He's captured a bunch of stuff, but white has got a lot done. White's castled, he's gotten his king to safety. That pawn on h2 is actually acting as a shield for the white king. It's not very easy to get to the light squares to attack the king. And of course the dark squares are sort of defended because there's a pawn sitting on the dark square directly in front of this pawn is actually a better defender for white than it is an attacker for black. So it's kind of a weird situation, but it's also a really fun position to play, especially starting here. Because starting right here, the threats are immediate and potentially devastating. So if black plays something that looks normal, or something where he tries to guard against these threats using any kind of normal move, he's going to walk right into one of the many threats of the position. So already it seems pretty obvious bishop f7, even just followed by knight takes h4, is a very serious threat. So it might look like a move like bishop f6 might be called for, preventing the knight from moving forward, trying to sort of meet the bishop takes f7 threat by blocking that f-file. But even something as simple as e5, bishop e7, and then simply bishop takes f7, king f7, knight g5 check, king e8, knight f7 should be completely winning and totally easy. That queen on d8 is gone. And basically white just has a winning position. And this is just one example of many examples on how white can win very easily from this position, starting here, starting from the beginning position of what I like to call the fun variation, I guess, the Burton Gambit. So what does black need to do to survive this? Well, in any situation where you've taken a whole bunch of pawns in exchange for development, the first thing you need to do is catch up in development. The development is actually a lot more important than the material. Black needs to catch back up in that development. The threats in this position are huge. So he needs to catch up in the development, and he needs to do it in a way that prevents these immediate threats from happening. So the only move that black can really play here is this move pawn to d5, because that makes this temporary attack on the bishop on c4. It prevents the bishop from capturing the pawn on f7 because we can't move through the pawn on d5. And it opens up the bishop on c8, so we're speeding up our development. We're getting our pieces back into play, back into the game. We're controlling more squares than we were a move ago. So here, white has 2 very reasonable responses. White can take that pawn on d5 with his bishop, or he can take it with his pawn. And it's not actually clear which one is better. And one of the hard things about analyzing this position is we don't actually have a lot of top-flight games to look at. And part of that problem is we're actually playing a sideline of a sideline. And if you want to be more specific, we're really playing a sideline of a sideline of a sideline. Because at the top levels, when you see the King's Gambit, you don't normally see the Cunningham variation to begin with. This is very rarely played, so that's already a sideline. And then after bishop to c4, at the top levels, you probably won't see bishop h4 check that often. Instead of that, you're going to see knight f6, which is a much more accurate move. Playing knight f6 to h5 is a much more accurate way to play the Cunningham. So bishop h4 is already a sideline of a sideline. And then here, the best move objectively is to play something like king f1, and white should have some sort of slight advantage. So instead, we're going to play this g3 move, which I like to call the fun variation. So now we're officially playing a sideline of a sideline of a sideline. So trying to find top games in a sideline of a sideline of a sideline is very, very difficult. So there's a good side to that and a bad side to that. The good side to that is there's a lot more unexplored territory. There's a lot more room to be creative. And of course, the downside of that is we don't have a lot of examples to give us even a general clue as to what the best play might be other than just sort of looking at engine preparation. So fg3 castles takes here. We go into the fun variation. Bishop d5 and e d5 are both possible. So let's take a look at bishop d5. So bishop d5, one idea that black has is black could try to develop that bishop right away. He could play something like bishop h3, but this is going to run into the immediate bishop takes f7, and apparently black doesn't have a great reply here. If, for example, king takes f7, we just have knight g5 check, king e8, knight h3, is supposed to be major advantage white. And if the king goes to f8, which happened in one game, there was a game of Maliki versus Osipo that was played back in 1994. That game continued with knight takes h4. Now, I made a previous video about this where I just didn't elaborate on this. But knight takes h4 wasn't actually the best move in that game. Knight takes h4 was a little questionable. White should have a decisive advantage after bishop to c4. If bishop c4 here, it's practically game over. The point is, after bishop to c4, we would see something like bishop takes f1, queen takes f1, and now there's all kinds of discoveries against the black king. It's not clear if there is a good move here, but we'll just do the computer best move. King e8, knight c3, knight to c6, pawn to d4. Everything's a threat right now. Knight takes h4, followed by queen f7. If knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen f7's a threat. Basically, queen f7's a threat. This is the problem. The queen coming to f7 with mate is a threat. So bishop e7 is sort of the only logical move to try to block all this, but then just knight g5 focuses 3 pieces on the f7 square, and then we're going to have knight h6 is really the only way to defend it. Knight to e6 focuses on g7, d8, h6. Now everything's hanging and something's got to give. So queen d7, knight g7, and then simply bishop takes h6. This should effectively be game over. But just to kind of give you an idea of how things could end, I came up with kind of a fantasy variation, like queen g4, bishop e6, queen g6, and then we sack it all. We play queen b5, give up the bishop on h6. We have queen takes b7, rook b8, queen c6 threatens mate. There's only one way to stop it. You got to sack a queen, and then we take, and then we checkmate anyway. So that would be an idea of what to do after bishop takes f7, king f8. So bishop h3 is not a great move. So what should black try? Black should try knight f6. Now, after knight f6, I don't actually have a great line for white. The line I gave in my previous video is still like the line I'm going to have to give because it's the line the computer gives, which is knight takes h4, knight d5, e d5, queen takes h4, queen e2, check, king d8, which I simply give as unclear. And I think unclear is a fair assessment because there is a lot going on here, but at the same time, it's a little disingenuous because the computer does give this as somewhere between major to decisive advantage black if everybody plays perfectly. And it's not clear where white can go differently either. So, for example, the line given by the computer is like knight c3, bishop g4, queen g2, knight d7, d3, rook e8, bishop to f4, pawn f6. And now it's just hard to come up with a way to improve here for white. So, for example, a4, g5, bishop g3, queen h5, d6, c6, and we run out of forward-moving moves that make progress or make sense. So we end up just, we can get some material back. We could play queen h2, king h2. This is what the engine wants to do. And then after f5, rook e1, f4, this should just be decisive advantage black. Somewhere between major to decisive advantage black. White is only down a pawn, but it's really clear that black has really nice pawns on the king side. He's got 3 connected passed pawns. It's going to be hard for us to break through. It's going to be hard to get the material back. It's going to be hard to make progress. But it's still a position that I'm going to mark as unclear because, I don't know, there might be places where we can go differently earlier. There might be things that we can do differently earlier. And that brings me back to, just kind of going in the big rewind machine here. That brings me back to this initial decision point between bishop d5 and e d5. e d5 may, in fact, be the better of the two options, just opening up that e-file for business. just playing something like e takes d5. Now, what's really interesting here is if we look at e takes d5, I have this game, Burger versus Roost, played back in 1994. And it's a super interesting game on a number of levels, but one of the main levels is it's the only game that I've found where somebody actually played the computer recommended and computer best move of knight to h6, which is apparently the best move in the position. That's how wildly complicated these positions are, is the best move something like knight h6, and other moves can of course quickly lead to decisive advantage white without a whole lot else going wrong. So knight to h6, and then that game was d4, and then we have knight f5, and then we have queen e2 check, king to f8, and now bishop to f4. So all of these moves seem really logical and really straightforward. We had bishop to g3 in that game, queen d2, knight d7, and then we had a mistake in that game. White did end up going on to win, which is kind of interesting, but he made this mistake of playing knight to c3, and it allowed this move knight to f6, which at least according to the engine, is actually decisive advantage black after knight to f6. Now what should have been played instead of knight c3 was this move bishop to d3, putting immediate pressure on that f5 knight, and sort of forcing black's next reply, because obviously if we take the knight on f5, or if the knight moves, the bishop on g3 is hanging. That means the bishop has to capture f4, queen takes f4, putting that traditional pressure down the f-file. Knight h6 is sort of forced, and then we just develop knight c3, knight f6, knight e5, and the point here is after, say, knight d5, queen d5, bishop to e4, it's not clear. It's not clear what black does here. As a matter of fact, this position might just be decisive advantage white, or somewhere between slight edge to decisive advantage, somewhere in that range. White is doing incredibly well here. One thing that you can note is just in this position by itself, black can't actually take on the d4 square because we have rook d1, and then there's this threat back here. Also, there's this triple attack on f7. This is all open, and of course none of black's pieces are developed, so you're left with the impression that black's position should be falling apart somehow. That it should be falling apart relatively quickly. So one of the lines the computer gives is something like queen d6, c4, f6, c5, queen to d8, and then d5 just advancing because black can't move apparently. Bishop h3, rook f3, queen to e8, rook to e1. And again, the computer gives decisive advantage white at this point just nothing can be captured. That knight on e5 can't be captured. The black king seemingly can't get out of these pins, can't move anywhere. You can't move your knight. You can't move anything. Everything's hanging for black. So we'll have something like rook e8. We can simply play d6, takes, queen to e6, pawn to t7, bishop g4, and then the rook just retreats. And we just continue to laugh at black's attempts to unwind in this position, which is a seemingly impossible task. And the computer just gives decisive advantage white right here. So I think that the fun variation, beginning with this whole mess of sacrifices, this g3, f takes g3, castles kingside, g captures h2, king h1. This fun variation, also called the Burton Gambit, if you want to be more official with it. So the purists are going to be like, you cannot rename things. No, okay, it's the Burton Gambit, but I like to call it the fun variation. So the Burton Gambit, also known as the fun variation. It's really interesting. It's really worth a shot. I would say that right now, at least from what I can tell, looking at the theory after d5, maybe the objectively better move to play here is e captures d5. But I'll also point out that there's just not a lot of games on this. This has been played very few times. The chances that your opponent is going to be familiar with this line, even if he plays the bishop e7, bishop h4 variation of the Cunningham, are slim. So the odds of getting your opponent just out of his book, just period, are really high. So the chances of getting quick victories with themes like bishop takes f7, king f7, knight e5, or g5, or even just knight captures h4, are also very high. So the odds of winning an early game are really good. And then, of course, if they do know the best moves, and if they know some of the best theory, your chances are not bad there either. So this is a really fun line to play. White has a ton of development for the 3 pawns that he's down in this position, and it's going to give you an interesting game. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you learned something new about the opening. I hope you found all this information helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.